Thank you so much, Peter, for introducing me. So I'm going to take maybe 5 or 10 minutes of your time and talk about what I think is a fairly big blind spot in the climate reporting debate. And the blind spot refers to a lot of political attention and effort having been devoted to reporting in the public company domain. Whereas I suspect most of the effects of climate change, the financial effects at least, probably show up for private companies, maybe the so called unorganized sector, households, and governments. So let me try and illustrate. So Lisa Liu, one of my colleagues at Columbia, and Sonakshi Agarwal, who's also a PhD student there, and I have just finished a paper where we do something fairly simple. We look at the severe weather events listed by FEMA and NOAA. This is publicly available data, and we try and match that to the geographically, at least we're looking at physical risk to establishments, what are called establishments, which are offices, distribution centers, factories within the path of a severe weather event such as a hurricane or a wildfire. So we can find both public companies and private companies, and all we're looking for is some kind of heartbeat or financial footprint because of these severe weather events on things like stock prices for public companies, cash flows, sales, earnings, and so on. So by and large, we don't find a whole lot of action for public companies. By and large, nothing seems to happen when you encounter these severe weather events for public companies, at least in terms of the geographical path of the hurricane or the wildfire. But interestingly, sales for private companies do seem to fall significantly. So the punchline being, at least in terms of physical risk, nothing much seems to happen for public companies. By and large, they seem to be fine, but private companies do suffer. So how do you make sense of this in a less abstract, more anecdotal case study kind of way? So I usually think of Brooklyn as an example in New York. So if Brooklyn were to be shut for, say, 3 days because of flooding, Amazon is probably not likely to be very affected, at least by the physical risk aspect of this climate event. The staff will simply work from home. The orders that Amazon gets will probably simply get rerouted to a different distribution center. Amazon can afford to buy insurance, or maybe they can self insure at a reasonable cost. They have access to credit lines or even the capital market if necessary to probably raise financing. But think of the proverbial, say, sandwich shop in Brooklyn. They shut shop for 3 days, potentially lose profits for the whole month. They don't have access to credit lines. They don't have access to insurance support or the managerial expertise that Amazon does. And I suspect there are hundreds of such, sandwich shops or small restaurants in Brooklyn. So the question becomes, are we ignoring the cumulative impact of these small losses over many, many establishments that fall outside the domain of the publicly listed universe? So where else will the impact of physical risk show up? I suspect eventually many of these losses will simply get socialized. So, we should look more carefully at municipal and government balance sheets as well. So, for instance, I suspect sales taxes for, say, Brooklyn would have fallen if, torrential rains perhaps shut down the borough for, say, 3 days. Or for a more extreme example, the state of Florida has issued bonds of about $600 million to effectively bail out or save insurers, hoping that they don't leave the state after Hurricane Ian. So the question becomes, are we as focused on getting municipalities and governments measure and report climate-related losses and escalated borrowing that will eventually have to be done to pay for these losses in the future? And I suspect something similar is at play with transition risk as well. The US EIA, which is the Energy Information Administration, reports that if, in terms of the number of wells the US has, oil wells, consider maybe wells that produce less than 15 barrels of oil equivalent per day. that number of these wells is like, it's an astonishing 77 odd percent in 2022. So when the energy transition comes, these 77% of the wells will simply get shut down or go out of business. We don't talk as much about that very long left tail, that 77%, and we spend a lot of attention and time, perhaps justifiably in a value-weighted sense, on the other 23%, which are probably the large publicly listed oil and gas companies and so on. So this is not to say that we should abandon advocacy for climate risk reporting for large public companies. It's more of a call to round out that knowledge and perhaps worry about the sector that we don't often look at least in research and policy, which is the small private companies, the unorganized sector, municipalities, governments. They need to be brought into the public reporting advocacy and the research as well. So I hope all of us, researchers, policymakers, push harder on this so-called blind spot or black hole of reporting, which is the non-public companies, small privates, governments, municipalities, the unorganized sector. So thank you, Peter.